Hello, I'm LemonBread. The Game Boy wasn't just a Game Boy, so to speak. In some regards, it was a real boy. So many different accessories, first and third party alike, released for the system. What can your Game Boy do? Mine can detect fish. A lot of these were mainly focused on upgrading the form factor of the Game Boy, but there were plenty of accessories that weren't just limited to the hardware of the Game Boy. Myriads of little gadgets and gizmos released for these systems, including, but not limited to, the Bandai Pocket Sonar, which Wikipedia describes as the first sonar-enabled gaming accessory, which terrifies me because it implies there were more. But none are ostensibly as popular as the Game Boy Camera and the Game Boy Printer. The Game Boy Camera and the Game Boy Printer both released in 1998, the same year as the Game Boy Color. Even though the GBC didn't last as long compared to the DS or GBA, or even the original Game Boy for that matter, Nintendo was still hell-bent on marketing this system, and it's clear the Game Boy Camera and Printer were steps in that direction. This was a different time for Nintendo, hell-bent on being weird and unique and radical and different, so why not go all out and make a printer and camera for the Game Boy? Because if they weren't going to do it, who was? The Game Boy Camera is, true to its name, a camera. If it were anything else, run. Originally revealed to warm reception in the company, it finally released in 1998 in multiple colors. I have the regular blue edition, but a red, yellow, and green variant were sold as well, and even a purple edition only for Japan. A version was released, however, a limited edition gold Game Boy camera for Legend of Zelda, essentially being the same thing but with some Legend of Zelda stickers. However, since it was only sold via Nintendo Power, this was definitely a weirder time for Nintendo. Whereas nowadays you can expect a semi-consistent level of quality across most Nintendo products, back in the 90s there was a lot of just throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what stuck, so I guess you could say the Game Boy Camera was a product of that era. You don't really see Nintendo come out with this stuff anymore. Like, yeah, they can be weird if given the opportunity, but it could be the last time they made a dedicated camera for one of their systems. Shut up. So let's power it on. Oh. Using this peripheral really showcases the weirdness of 90s Nintendo. One thing you have to understand is that whenever you use this thing, it's like sensory overload. You boot up the camera and you're treated with... You hit start. Each menu in this game is something entirely different with its own art style and everything, which makes using this thing unique, to say the least. And you could argue that things like this make the UI a nightmare to use, and you'd be correct. But it is undeniably charming nonetheless. I feel like Nintendo doesn't really make UIs like this anymore. I mean, what do we have now? Riveting. But every menu has something entirely new to it. Hell, the game select screen takes place within another game. Even the shoot menu takes place within an RPG menu, with different functions being represented by different actions you could do in an RPG. And if we hit the run button, this screen is infamous in online discussions about the Game Boy Camera. Now, if you were ever like me as a child, I'm sorry, but if you were ever like me as a child and you used to watch a lot of videos like the top 10 scariest Nintendo Easter eggs, you'd be well acquainted with this screen. He's like a best friend to me. Now, if you were a kid in the 90s and you randomly stumbled across this screen, I'm sure it'd be pretty scary, but nowadays, if anything, it's just kinda silly. If anything, it really showcases the oddities of the Game Boy Camera. Oh right, this thing has a camera. It's actually not that bad. I mean, you could only expect so much to come out of 90s Game Boy technology, but the clarity of this thing is a lot clearer than what I thought it'd be. Like, yeah, it's me. One big feature of the Game Boy Camera, though, is the 180-degree swivel it has. Yes, simply by snapping the damned thing's neck, you can turn it from a normal camera into a sort of selfie mode. And this is really cool because it may be the first digital camera designed for selfie taking. Way before selfies were a big thing, it really shows the ultra-personalized approach Nintendo is taking with the Game Boy Camera. Plus, although the camera is limited, people have found creative ways to use it. Neil Young's album, Silver and Gold, features an album cover taken by his daughter on a Game Boy Camera, and several photographers have found ways to create color photographs by using the Game Boy Camera. It truly shows how robust this camera can be, despite its limitations. One thing about the Game Boy Camera though, is that I feel like the features of the thing far outweigh the actual camera itself. Like yeah, Nintendo could have just made a simple camera and some basic features for the Game Boy, no points, no quills, no pillows, and if an accessory like this was released nowadays, that's probably the route they would have chosen. But the Game Boy Camera is much more than just a simple camera. It's a full-on game, boy. Why'd I say that? This thing is jam-packed with different features and novelties. Shooting for the thing itself, there are loads of different things you can change, such as color palette or dithering. One tip for shooting on the Game Boy Advance SP, which is the Game Boy I have, is that you can flip the camera to shoot upside down, or in this case, right side up. It's still kinda awkward, but it's far better than having to hold the system upside down to take photos. There are also a bunch of different customization options too, such as stamps and doodles. You can do panoramic shots or montages, weird fusion thingies, slideshows, hotspots where you make a certain event happen when you click an element of the picture. Little animations. Hell yeah. There are mini games which use photos of yourself as the player character, like Ball or DJ, which you can only access inside of another game, Space Fever 2, which is actually a sequel to one of Nintendo's arcade games, and getting to a certain score in it takes you to another game and then the credits and... Oh. This isn't even scratching the surface of all the stuff in this thing. Okay, well it did scratch a lot of the surface, but there's a lot more I could go on about. And one specific feature of the Game Boy Camera, which I haven't mentioned yet, is its unique ability to print photos. But of course I can't do that by itself, right? No, it needs a companion. The Game Boy Printer prints photos. Tell me something I don't know. It's essentially the companion piece to the Game Boy Camera, but isn't exclusive to it only. I guess the idea for this thing was that as you played games you could unlock extras that could be printed through the Game Boy Printer, and shared with friends and the like. At least that's the route many games that were compatible with this thing chose to go down. Extras. Really feels like the Game Boy Printer was meant for just extras, because this thing feels like way more of a novelty than even the Game Boy Camera. But it's hard to blame them because what other functionality would a printer provide other than print? Speaking of printing, how does it hold up? Let's try printing something from the camera. How about this one? I think it'd be a solid test for this thing. Well, one thing you've got to understand about the Game Boy Printer is that it is nearly 26 years old, and so is the paper. So not only is it pretty hard to find, I was thankfully given some as part of the eBay listing, but it also is really unreliable because of age. So more often than not, photos will just come out looking like this. But alright, fine. Let me try a different game, like Super Mario Bros. Deluxe.
You know the Game Boy was a printer?
Right you are, my good bitch, because not only does Mario Bros. Deluxe serve as a mediocre port of the original game, but it also features a printable horoscope. If there's anything I'd put the entirety of my trust into, it'd be this game. So let's see mine... Oh. Whatever, now that I can print it, it might be able to come true. I really gotta rethink what I put my trust into. It is a lot clearer than the Game Boy Camera photo, since these are at least cartoon characters that are a lot more clearly defined, but either way, this isn't too far off from looking like the Shroud of Turin. But it's fine, I swear, because the folks who sold me this and the camera were generous enough to provide me with not one, but 2 rolls of printer paper. This specific roll is blue tinted and smells funny. Apparently a Game Boy printer paper came in multiple different colors, so this one happens to be the standard blue variant. I hope. But it also came in colors such as white and cream. That's it. So after removing the first roll in an oddly specific and detailed manner, we can now insert the new paper. Fun fact, if you hold down the feed button while the system powers on, it'll show you this cute little message, which you can see here. I honestly didn't expect this paper to be as clear as it is, given its age and color, but you can still see things fairly well on it, even if it is pretty faded. But I came strangely prepared for this, because I bought another roll off of eBay, which happens to be the roll in my printer right now. You can buy these fan-made rolls off of eBay or Etsy for relatively cheap, and they can print off far more higher quality photos than the original rolls could because of their size. But I will say this new paper is a lot flimsier than the original printer paper. Now, the original printer paper had this adhesive backing you could peel off and stick to walls, I guess, but given its age, you can probably imagine how well it sticks nowadays. This new paper, on the flip side, is just receipt paper sawed down to fit inside the printer, so you have to take a little bit more care in handling it. I actually managed to get it jammed, not like this footage gives it any justice.
It's stuck.
But it's fairly simple to get it out. Big thanks to Nintendo, surprisingly, their UK website still has support pages for the printer up to this day, or at least as of the making of this video. But after inserting it and having the camera turn itself off so I lost some footage, we can now see how it prints.
I say that went pretty well.
Now I can finally replace all my photos. So that was the GameBoy Camera and the GameBoy Printer, arguably the biggest or at least most well-known accessories for the Game Boy. But what did Nintendo do after they released? Well, as for the camera, Nintendo actually integrated it into Mario Artist, which allows you to transfer camera images into the short-lived 64 disk drive with the transfer pack for use in game. And as for the printer, Nintendo continued to release Game Boy Printer patented printer paper all the way up until 2007. Who the hell was playing Game Boy games in 2007? Apart from these, though, not a lot was done with both peripherals, and they both fell into partial obscurity. But that doesn't mean Nintendo was finished, per se, because there were plans to bring the idea of the Game Boy Camera into the next generation. Stage Debut was a planned GameCube game in which images could be transferred onto human faces, a la Mario Artist, and the way that you were supposed to do this was with the Nintendo GameEye, which was essentially the Game Boy Advance successor to the Game Boy Camera. Both Stage Debut and the GameEye were sadly cancelled, however, yet the core idea of the Stage Debut concept transformed over time to become Nintendo's Mii's, while the GameEye was sadly forgotten about as a relic of the past. But the GameEye dream did not entirely die out. Nyko is a company you may be somewhat familiar with. They're responsible for a lot of cheap third-party controllers and accessories in the same vein as Mad Catz. But if you grew up with an original Game Boy Advance, you may remember them most for the Nyko WormLight, a cheap lamp that lights up the GBA screen, kinda. I actually have a bit of personal history with the Nyko WormLight. I had an original Game Boy Advance at one point, and like other people, probably, I started to get a little frustrated by how little I could see the screen. So I caved, and copped like $10 for a new Nyko WormLight, and proceeded to break it within like 5 minutes. To be fair, I have no idea if it was the device's fault or mine. But it looks like Nyko is back at it again with their own Game Boy camera, the GBA Nyko WormCam. I don't know what was up with their scheme of naming things with worm in it, but if the WormLight is any indication of this thing's quality, I'm anxious. So here's the Nyko WormCam. I bought this for $20 on eBay new. Can you believe no one bought this? This really is turning into a Dank Pods video. Aw man, I was hoping there'd be an actual Game Boy in there. Rotating lens, 180 degrees. You see, like the Game Boy camera, this thing can go from a normal camera to a sort of selfie mode, but unlike the Game Boy camera, which rotates on a horizontal axis, this thing rotates on a vertical axis. So you have to think of creative and new ways to break this thing's neck. System requirements. The Game Boy? When's the last time you saw a Game Boy accessory run on Windows 95 or higher? Editor, slideshow, spy cam, lighting. Yeah, I sure hope it has lighting. PC link. You see, I doubt this thing is going to work on my modern day Windows 10 PC, but I do have this Windows XP laptop I've been keeping all my dust on, so that should suffice. Contains software CD and instruction booklet. contient disque logiciel et manuel d'instructions. This is oddly in-depth for a Game Boy accessory, and I can't say my expectations are too high, but I guess the only way to find out is to open it. I'd like a good stern talking to whoever came up with this type of packaging. But we did it. We got it out, mostly. As much as I'd like to get into the software of this thing, I feel like I'm gonna wait, just so I can actually see if the accessory works with my Game Boy. Now, I have an SP, and I saw a single eBay listing saying this doesn't work on the SP, so I'm a bit apprehensive, but if I'm gonna get disappointed in this video, it might as well be now. Well, hey, yeah, so funny story. So after bribing one of my friends into giving me one of their Game Boy Advances, we can actually see how this thing works. One interesting thing about this peripheral is that it's not actually licensed by Nintendo, so it doesn't use actual ROM cartridge technology, but instead transfers all of its data through the link cable. This means that whenever you power the system on, it downloads all of its data into the Game Boy Advance itself. So you can just yank the damned thing out and it'll still work, so long as you don't put it back in. I've never seen anything do this before, and that's probably for the better. Because everything has to be downloaded into the system, it runs so slowly. Even going through the extremely basic menus feels time consuming, much less actually taking a photo. I've had to restart my system many times because it gets stuck permanently trying to save my photo, meaning I couldn't do anything else with the system. Speaking of photos, what photos? Keep in mind, I've opened this thing up new and unused last week around, and only after like 2 days of using it on actual hardware, it started malfunctioning and taking photos that looked like clown vomit. And now it won't even take any photos at all. It just got stuck on this screen, and like I said, I can't do anything with it while it's stuck saving nothing. I don't know if this is an issue with the camera or the system itself, but either way, it is a huge disappointment, and worst of all, it deleted all of the photos I had in the system, so I can't even show you what they looked like. I did find some actual photos online though, so we can get a glimpse of what they look like. Now, for the Game Boy Advance, they're actually not too bad. Of course, it's not going to be the best quality. If you're at all familiar with the GBA video line, you'd understand that, but it is a step up from the Game Boy Camera's camera. You know it isn't a step up from the Game Boy Camera though? Everything else. Like I said, because it loads everything through the link cable, everything about the system feels really sluggish and slow, and very rudimentary. The lighting settings too are extremely touchy. Even if the photos I took were coherent, it's not like you'd be able to make them out because, from my experiences, they're either really washed out or really dark. This review from Insider says it best. The lighting in the system is like having an air conditioner that has 4 settings. Basically off, slightly blowing, medium, and hurricane. Trying to get between medium and hurricane is impossible, and thus flexibility is at a minimum. Also, there's no preview or viewfinder or anything, so you'll have no idea what the photo will look like until after you've taken the photo, which, as I already established, can take forever to finish processing. At the very least, we can hook it up to my laptop, right? This is probably the worst the Game Boy Advance has let me down. So how is the WormCam? Well, I can't really fairly judge this thing as a standalone product because, like I said, mine is most likely defective. But I'm going to do my best to try and review this thing as fairly as I can. Just know that your experiences with this thing are probably going to be very different from mine. Now, the lack of quality in this thing could be excused if it was just marketed as a cheap toy for the Game Boy Advance, but we need to understand some of the context that surrounded this thing's release. This was released in the early 2000s, and back then, digital cameras were a bit more pricey than how they are now. So it's clear to see that this thing was specifically designed and marketed as an alternative for those cameras. And while this may have had some sort of value, any and all semblance of value that this thing had back then is all but lost nowadays. Even for the time, this was a really subpar product, so it's easy to see why it never quite took off. It's slow, it's clunky, it feels really cheap to use, and the photos it does take are really washed out and muddy. The only real reason why you'd want to buy this thing nowadays is for the cheap novelty of it. I did buy this thing for only 20 bucks after all, but if you want to get something for the novelty of it, then just buy a Game Boy Camera. Sure, it may be more expensive than the WormCam, but I guarantee you're going to get far more value and worth out of this than this. The Game Boy Camera and Printer, as weird and conspicuous as they were, both represent a different era for Nintendo. Far before Nintendo was hell-bent on innovating with each new console, Nintendo didn't really have the technological means to advance far beyond the power of the N64. So, in order to make themselves stand out far more than other companies at the time, apart from their weirder marketing campaigns, was with things like the Game Boy Camera and Printer. This was a far more experimental age for gaming. Now, it's not like the marketplace isn't experimental anymore. Consoles like the Wii, Notch U, and Switch have proved themselves to be highly popular with people. But in the 90s, a lot of what was done was just throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what stuck, for better or for worse. I see these two peripherals as sort of gateways into those times, even if they aren't quite indicative of that time period as a whole. Their uniqueness is something that isn't quite found in modern Nintendo. Even their more recent gimmicky ideas like the Wii U don't have that same vibe. Now as for the WormCam, if anything it just shows how third-party companies would try to imitate the success of first-party peripherals to middling results. Does it work as a digital camera? In 2003 maybe, but nowadays no. Does it work as a Game Boy accessory? Not really. Does it work in general? At least for me, no. You're better off saving your cash for an actual Game Boy camera, because sure, it may be pricier, but I guarantee you're gonna get far more value out of that thing than this thing. I'd say it's more fun than the WormCam, but I think anything is more fun than this thing. Well, I hate to end this video on such a negative note, so I thought I'd close this video off by showing off some neat camera-related things I found while doing some hasty Google work. The look and feel of Game Boy camera photos is actually quite sought out, as there are many different web apps or filters that emulate that look. So if you find yourself unable to afford a Game Boy camera, which, I mean, hey, I don't blame you, there are still ways of getting that feeling without the need of an actual Game Boy. Game Boy camera photos have also been used in pretty cool ways, such as this photo I found of the 2024 eclipse taken on a Game Boy camera by Tyler Blair. There are also ways of doing color photography with the Game Boy camera. Now, I can't really demonstrate it for you right now, but it's essentially done in a similar way to how it was done back in the 1800s with actual photographs, which I think is super cool. I genuinely love the Game Boy camera. It's one of my favorite Game Boy things, and it's super fun to just sit down and toy around with this thing for a few minutes. But can I feasibly recommend the Game Boy camera? Now, most Game Boy cameras will run you for around 50 bucks for a used one, and even more for a boxed one. So I guess it depends on how much you'd be willing to spend on what is essentially a toy. But me simply talking about this thing doesn't quite give it justice on how cool and fun this thing is. So if you have the means to buy it, I highly recommend you do. And if you don't, or just want to save a bit of money, there are still ways of getting that Game Boy camera quality without a Game Boy. And ROMs of it do work on actual Nintendo hardware, so I still recommend you try it out. Now, as for the WormCam, I highly doubt we'll be talking about that one as much anymore.